Allow me to begin by congratulating you on your wisdom in having come to what is going to be the most exciting session of this 15th DSDS. And that's going to be significantly due to you, because I've agreed with all of the moderators that they will make brief and inspiring introductory remarks, and then we will create lots of space for you to come with comments and questions and really get some interaction going with the floor. So I'm going to have to exercise some strong discipline on the panelists. As was said in the introduction of me, I have spent many years negotiating all kinds of targets at the national level, in the European Union, and at the international level. And I now work for a very practical organization that doesn't get involved in politics at all, the Global Green Growth Institute, which focuses on helping our member countries, at the moment 24 member countries, find a greener model of economic growth. So I work in a very practical place where politics is very distant. In saying that, I don't want to create the impression that I do not think that formulating goals is important. The Millennium Development Goals, many of the national policy goals that countries have formulated, have actually helped to keep regional, national, and international leadership on track. And now we're on the way to formulating the Sustainable Development Goals to follow on from the Millennium Development Goals. And this is critical because we're actually not doing terribly well. As many of you know, inequities around the world are increasing. We still have extreme poverty in many parts of the world, and many of the global challenges are becoming more severe rather than less severe. Income disparities are not going away. In fact, many would argue, and probably some of the panelists will argue, that those disparities are actually having a negative impact on growth. That poverty and disparity are breeding discontent, conflict, and perhaps even extremism in many parts of the world. And I hope that some of the panelists will focus on these questions. Focus on how can we actually formulate the Sustainable Development Goals in a way that is equitable? And more importantly, how can we achieve them in ways that actually will mean that we address disparity? We have a great panel to talk about these issues. I'll just pick out one or two of the panelists. We have amongst the panelists Dr. Shamshad Akhtar, and I saw in your CV that one of the things that you have done is spearheaded the World Bank response to the Arab Spring, which I think was very much about disparity, so I'll be very interested in your views in that context. An old friend of mine, Professor Hironori Yamanaka, who has been involved internationally, but has also worked on many policies, implementing many policies in the domestic context. Mr. Alexander Likotal, who has written interestingly, on environmental acceptability as a driver of a new civilization. So what is the role of environment in that context? And then my very old friend and sometimes sparring partner, Manjeev Puri, who was a lead negotiator to the UN conference on sustainable development, very closely involved in the climate change negotiations, very familiar with issues around different countries' responsibilities and capabilities. Those are just a few of the panelists. They will, I think, lay the foundation for a very interesting discussion. What I'm going to do is ask each of the panelists to speak for just 5 minutes, and then, as I promised, open up the floor to all of you for comments and, I hope, a lively debate. So first over to Dr. Shamshad Akhtar, the UN Under-Secretary General and Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Madam, you have the floor.
Excellencies, distinguished panelists, and guests. I'm going to make 4 or 5 points, and I hope I can manage in 5 minutes. I will skip the Arab Spring, which will take me 4 or 5 hours. So first, we have a slide that I wanted to present. so that I don't speak a lot, this slide, as you will see, captures the income and wealth disparities that are on the rise in the Asia and the Pacific region that I represent from my commission at present. And the short word is that this is all undermining the quality of the growth outcomes in the region. As you are probably aware, empirical evidence is increasingly showing that there is a growing recognition of deficiencies in the measurement of economic growth, which captures primarily income movements, but ignores the distributional implications of social disparities as well as natural capital and its use, impeding the transmission of growth benefits to the poor. At the same time, there is increasing mistrust of economic theories and models that concentrate exclusively on growth rather than on the distribution of benefits and prosperity. This neglects the wider spectrum of development dimensions that has led to a wave of new economic thinking. I'm not going to cover the literature on new economic thinking. Suffice to say that currently there is on offer an alternative development paradigm, global agreement on a holistic and integrated approach to sustainability in all its dimensions. This will allow us to more effectively tackle distributional, inclusivity, and intergenerational concerns with a focus on both excess and excesses. Fully integrating sustainability into our development discourse is ever more urgent today, as evidence grows of pervasive inequalities and wealth concentration with a directly dampening impact on economic growth. My second point is to borrow from an image from former Governor Schwarzenegger, who was here this morning, his remarks on action heroes this morning. It is important to recognize that inequality is the nemesis of sustainable development. It undermines both the pace and durability of growth, which in turn retards progress on poverty and access to services. Inequality further undermines social cohesion and solidarity, as we witnessed in the Arab Spring. Growing gaps between rich and poor often see rising crime and political unrest, ethnic polarization, and radicalization. Inequality also hampers environmental sustainability, where inequality abounds. Collective action on public goods like the environment, tends to be trumpeted by pursuit of individual interests. Equality has an even greater impact on growth than higher levels of free trade, low government corruption, foreign investment, or low foreign debt. So it is important that we nurture growth with equality. This brings me to my third point, which is inclusive growth. It is the best means of tackling inequality. Inequality is an outcome of non-inclusive growth, which marginalizes those at the lower end of the income spectrum. It is intensified by poor governance, ineffective institutions, and the political economy of vested interests. Moving from the debates about trade-offs between the interest of growth, social equity, and environmental protection, inclusive growth goes beyond the short-termism that for decades has emphasized maximization of short-term GDP growth at the expense of people and planet. Inclusive growth focuses instead on long-term goals of sustainable development. So how do you harness inclusive growth? By structural reforms that introduce job-generating growth, effective competition policies, strong institutions which prevent arbitrage and encourage just fair practices, socially and financially sustainable welfare system financed by progressive tax regimes, as well as checks and balances on rent-seeking, illicit financing, etc. My final point is that the SDGs that you have heard so much about are an embodiment of these values and principles. The SDG framework advocates adoption of long-term goals to tackle inequalities of income and of opportunity. Poverty eradication and equality are identified as a core and pervasive element of sustainable development. A number of the 17 proposed goals reinforce equality, with one emphasizing strong, sustainable, inclusive, and job-generating growth, and another dedicated goal that specifically calls for reducing inequality within and among countries. Complementing these two core goals are a number of other thematic and sector-specific proposed SDGs, which focus on gender equality, equitable provision of quality education, and equality in access to services of various kinds. To finally conclude, it is key to recognize that SDG framework deals with inequality in its most narrow and in its broader sense, as it addresses income, social, environmental disparities within countries, and also extends the scope of coverage to inter-country disparities as well. Let me end by quoting from Professor Sen, who we all value. He said, "The major factors that limit the freedom are poverty as well as tyranny, poor economic opportunities, as well as systematic social deprivation, neglect of public facilities, as well as intolerance or overactivity of repressive states." The SDGs aim to tackle these limitations in pursuit of larger freedom for all, addressing inequality, inequity, and injustice for the future we want for all. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Akhtar, for those introductory remarks. I hope as we get into the discussion with the people in the room that you will be asked to give some examples of inclusive growth policies in this particular region, which you feel are worth following for the rest of us. But let me now give the floor to Professor Hironori Yamanaka, the chair of the Board of Directors of the Institute of Global Environmental Strategies.
Esteemed guests, distinguished colleagues and friends, it is my great honor and pleasure to be able to provide remarks for the Delhi Sustainable Development Summit on the theme of SDGs in a world of wealth and income disparities. As many of us know, the Rio Plus 20 conference in 2012, governments agreed to formulate global sustainable development goals. On 4th December last year, the latest milestone in this process came when UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon presented his draft synthesis report on the post-2015 development agenda. With this report, the intergovernmental negotiation process on SDGs is now entering the final lap. Upcoming negotiations will likely conclude with a declaration on the post-2015 development agenda in September this year. This declaration will, in turn, likely include SDGs. At this point, all indications suggest there will be 17 SDGs with 169 underlying targets. The proposed goals and supporting targets cover many areas of critical importance for economic development, human well-being, and environmental sustainability. However, experience from many earlier goal-setting efforts, most notably the Millennium Development Goals, shows that agreeing on global goals is merely the first step. Achieving them will be the real litmus test, and achieving global goals increasingly depends on governance. In short, sustainable development is contingent on global governance, good governance. At IGS, we take the role of governance seriously. We are currently engaged in a project that analyzes what forms of governance will be needed at the global, national, and local levels to implement likely SDGs. The project employs methods ranging from quantitative data analysis to single country case studies as a basis for findings. Some of those findings suggest that the key to making progress on the previous MDGs was capable and effective governments that protected the rule of law. Without effective governments and the rule of law, our research shows countries struggled to make progress on MDGs. Given that SDGs are likely to be more integrated and aspirational in nature, it will be exceedingly difficult for countries to meet essential needs absent these prerequisites. But governance for the MDGs is likely to differ from the SDGs in several important respects. The one that is most relevant to today's panel is inclusivity, and this was mentioned by my earlier panelist, Dr. Akhtar. The future we want will hinge not only simply more development, but more inclusive development. At IGES, we have also begun to conduct research on how to engage marginalized segments of the population in decisions that would improve their and others' well-being. Some examples include a project under the Asian Development Bank on mainstreaming gender in climate mitigation initiatives in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Others include a project in Bandung, Indonesia, that aims to bring motorcycle taxi drivers into process that can earn carbon finance. These are just a small sampling of activities that we hope will reshape the development agenda for the next century. Reshaping that agenda will also help close the wealth and income disparities. That is the main theme of today's panel. This leads to me to final point related to the panel's main theme, narrowing wealth and income disparities, which is not only about including people, it's also about empowering people. One of the remarkable features of DSDS is that it creates an opportunity to both include and empower diverse voices. With that sentiment, I look forward to a dialogue that brings us closer to a more equitable and sustainable world. I thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Professor Yamanaka. You referred in your introduction to the need for global governance reform, perhaps, but you didn't say anything about it. So I'm hoping that people will ask you questions about that particular topic, so you get a chance to say where you see the opportunities and need for change. But let me first give the floor to Dr. Alexander Likotal, President of the Green Cross International. You have the floor, sir.
It's a great privilege to be able to address this distinguished forum for many reasons, but I will skip the reasons, believe me. I really mean it. Listening to the discussions this morning, I tried to find out what was the most oftenly repeated term. And it came to my mind that it was transformation, change, transition. Well, on one side, it's absolutely understandable. But on the other side, I think that we should be a little bit more concerned about what we mean by change, transformation, because when we're talking about the disparities, social, economical, wealth disparities, I have a very strange feeling. You know, it was Albert Einstein who said once that if you are continuing doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome, this is exactly the clear definition of insanity. And that seems what we are doing to me. Maybe I'm a little bit alarmistic or critical, but you know, when I read the upbeat reports about the results that we have cut twice the poverty in the world, I get concerned, because today, as compared to the previous decades, the ratio between the wealth of the wealthy and non-poor states is, it used to be 40-to-1 correlation, today it's 80-to-1. Oxfam recently published a report that next year we will be crossing the threshold when 1% of the world population will own more than 99% of the world population. And I think that in this condition, to say that the MDGs were fulfilled in terms of poverty eradication are a little bit not correct. I think that the biggest problem today is that the policy lagging behind the process of transformation. Politicians cannot get in tune with that. And it also reminds the joke that the patient asks the doctor, you know, whenever I touch myself with a finger, it aches, I feel it hurts. The doctor examines him and says, oh dear, but you have a broken finger. Maybe we have the broken finger in terms of the modern politics that should be changed in order not to feel the pain and hurt. We need to reformulate the agenda, the frameworks that we use. We need to encourage transformative leadership in politics. But instead of that, we have a fragmented integrality approach. We understand the world is connected, but still we apply the babysitter syndrome. Priority is given to where the biggest noise comes from. Today it's Ebola, tomorrow it's terrorism, now it's Ukraine in Europe, etc., endless. And we fail majorly to apply systemic approach to the challenges we face. This is the biggest problem that we face today. The crisis of 2008, 2009 was a sort of a transit point to a new historical period in our development. In fact, it revealed a huge discrepancy between the growing interdependence, globalization, and at the same time, the lacking coordination between the nations. And from that point, we reached a point of bifurcation. There are two options to rebalance the situation: either to strengthen the interdependence of the world, or to go on the deglobalization track. Unfortunately, I must say that what I see is going in the latter direction rather than in the first. And this exacerbates all the problems we have, from poverty to climate change, from water issues to energy and food. Clever euphemisms do not help. Green economy, sustainable shared growth, etc., etc. If the system is faulty, you cannot resolve the situation by raising its efficiency or making it more accountable. We need to change some basics in the systems of our world. And finally, I see that it's already blinking the time. It's very important that the state encourages business and economy going in this way. And at the same time, it's important what will be the reaction of business. Because business, we shouldn't be idealistic about that. It's clear for me that business of business is business. It will never become a non-for-profit activity. That should be clear. But we need to decouple growth from the use of materials and energy, and this is doable, and there are ways to the circular economy which are picked up of the frontier business to leaders already today. So the main idea, the main message, we shouldn't be looking for creation of the heaven on earth. We are not looking to create a ladder to this heaven. Vice versa, we should think about the safety net that could prevent sliding the world into the hell. And this could be done if we just stop fighting the future, which is already here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Doctor. I'm sort of left wondering if politicians are the broken finger of change, then how is the state going to encourage the private sector to move in a different direction? Maybe that's a good point for later in the discussion. But in the meantime, I would like to give the floor to Ambassador Manjeev Puri, Ambassador of India to the European Union, Belgium, and Luxembourg.
Mr. de Boer, first of all, I must say that I am standing here and speaking to you in the one capacity that will always be mine, which is my personal capacity. I have, for many years, been part of this climate change negotiation, sustainable development. And I happen to be coming to Delhi, and Terry, with whom I'm great friends, Dr. Pachauri, Dr. Pradipto Ghosh, they were very kind and said, please come and join us, and I'm grateful to them for this honor. Friends, when we walked into this room, Under Secretary General Akhtar, who I have known from New York, remarked that, oh, I wish this session had taken place earlier in the day. Now, coming from the host country, it seems to me that, I need to sort of pony up to that and somehow or the other liven up the discourse here. And as I said, I'm speaking in my personal capacity. For the views of the Government of India, you have my colleague from the ministry here, and this will be left to him. And I want to focus essentially on the subject matter which is not being talked of here, but which is part of the SDG goal. And let me remind you, the goal is about within and among countries. I don't think many of us, after looking at the slide by the Undersecretary, have any great issue about the fact that we need inclusivity within countries, that we need to do something about these income disparities which are coming about, and that the figures are startling to say the least. I also hope that we all are in agreement that this particular issue of disparity within countries needs to be addressed in all societies, including the developed ones. And I sincerely hope that nobody thinks this is some kind of a socialist agenda or anything of that kind at all. My real proposition here to you is to get you all to see that the international community galvanizes itself so that there is an environment in which we see a reduction of inequalities among countries. Ladies and gentlemen, you've seen a lot of figures about disparities between countries, among countries, between people within the same country. But I must tell you that the critical figure that we must not lose sight of in this entire quest for disparity is that 1.3 billion people around the world still live at less than $1.25 a day. That figure, ladies and gentlemen, is the population of the United States plus twice that of Europe. Let me also make the point to you that on the issue of inequality, we need to be mindful of the fact that we need to address this not only in the area of wealth, but also in several other areas as a result of human endeavors, which includes governance, global governance, sir. I'm grateful to you for having pointed out the issues of governance, trade regimes, and basically ensure that there is greater policy space and voice for developing countries. So what should be done to curb inequalities among countries? Obviously, Goal 10 is a helpful pointer. It has a number of targets spread across a useful spectrum of action, both at national as well as international levels. But let me posit here to you that most importantly, action on the goal would be meaningful if we pushed for more economic growth in developing countries, and certainly not less. And in any case, we should stop trying to pitch for lowering their ambitions on growth to focus on curbing inequality. We must be clear that as while we need to mobilize and upscale investments in social and human capital development, in education, in healthcare, rural development, housing, rural infrastructure, we also need to rapidly create new productive job opportunities for our people. Equity in these dual efforts is only possible if there is growth and serious aggregate wealth creation. And we need to simultaneously urgently address the wider global inequality in terms of consumption of resources. This is germane not just for sustainable development as a whole, but to the SDGs in particular. Let me also quote a few facts and figures. The high-level panel set up by the UN Secretary General pointed out that 1.2 billion people living in extreme poverty account for only 1% of the world's consumption of resources, while the richest 1 billion consume 72%. The per capita consumption of energy in OECD countries is more than double the global average and 7 times more than in India and Africa. That 1.3 billion tons of food produced is wasted every year, or that wastage of food at consumer level alone in industrialized countries in nearly as much as the total food production in sub-Saharan Africa. These are all important elements of inequality that we need to talk about. And I am not wanting to belabor myself on the inequity in the global consumption of carbon and the widely divergent per capita carbon footprints. So much will be said here about renewables. I'm very happy that my minister in the morning when he was speaking spoke about the huge target on renewables that India wants to move for. I come from a world where many years back, perhaps Mr. De Boer would remember, I would be among the few people standing up and trying to ward off accepting an internationally agreed target for India in renewables. Today I find I'm the only one standing there to say, come on, let's push and do some things on renewables. What do I find? There is even lack of willingness to collaborate on innovation and on disruptive technologies in the area of renewables. We have a great feeling that the new deal that is being talked about a cap at a particular point in time among the largest players in the game, would result and give a great push to the development of renewables technology. I sincerely hope so. My country certainly needs it. But my fear, and what have I seen, is that much of all of this has gone in the direction of production of further hydrocarbons, shale gas. You have endless amounts of that. And frankly, Governor Schwarzenegger mentioned today in the morning about the Liverpool lab. Some of us had the great privilege of being there when Professor Stephen Chu was its head. And the work that they were doing there 10 years back, I haven't heard even anybody talk about that anymore. So that's the bottom line and the state of affairs where things are. I know I've overshot my time, so let me try and sum up. Mr. De Boer, inequality within countries must be tackled, is an absolute serious matter, and we must have inclusivity. But this is essentially in the domain of countries themselves. Internationally, our efforts need to be to ensure that the balancing efforts spreads wealth, for which growth is imperative, and not, as we used to say some time back, redistributing poverty. Several long-term estimates for GDP state that in the next 2 decades, as many as 3 of the 5 largest economies will not be from the OECD. But at the same time, it needs to be remembered that when it comes to per capita income, even the top of these 3 remain quite some distant from the levels of the developed world. Countries with large demographics will, by definition, have larger aggregates, and this should be accepted and outcomes not sought to be colored by politics of hegemony and global power equations. I thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. We actually have the beginnings of a storyline, in the sense that you, Ambassador, talked about disparity within countries and jobs as a solution to that. Dr. Akhtar talked about inclusive growth policies that can help in that context. Mr. Lichterhal indicated that those policies will only be successful if the state is better in catalyzing, mobilizing, or enthusing the private sector. And Professor Yamanaka then said, well, that's all fine, but we still need reform in global governance, including to get to the kind of international equity that Ambassador Puri was talking about. So the circle is round. The only question the panelists haven't answered yet is how the Sustainable Development Goals are going to help in that context. So perhaps we can talk about that a bit later. But first, I would like to give the floor to the last but certainly not least panelist, Dr. P.C. Matani, Director at the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. You have the floor, sir.
I represent Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, Government of India. Secretary Mr. Upen Tripathi was supposed to be here, but our minister called him at the last moment. My apologies on part of the ministry that he was not there. I am representing him. Sustainable development goals and inequalities, this is the topic of this discussion. We have heard the big people speaking in the global context, in overall overarching context. I will try to confine myself on one item only, that the access to energy. This is one of the most sought after and negotiated this sustainable development goal, which seeks universal access to energy to all the people by 2030, and also looks for doubling the share of renewable energy in the global energy mix by 2030. Let us have some reality check in the context of India. Forget about others, because just Ambassador Puri mentioned that 1.3 billion people have less than $1. So there is an issue on that. The census 2011 is the last data, which apart from the NSSO data, which talks of what are the level of access in this country. It says that still 45% of the rural population in this country is without electricity access. Huge number. If we translate into the numbers, it comes around 78 million households. And also that around 86% of the rural population still cook their meal in traditional biomass cook stoves, 3 stoves and full of the polish and others. So the task before us is quite clear, that if this SDG is adopted, then apart from our national ambitions, there is a global ambition that by 2030, everybody should have modern cooking energy and modern lighting services. This is the task. Let us look at what exactly it means. If you go back 10 years back in 2001, the percentage of population which was without electricity service was 55% in the rural context. And it has reduced to 45%. But in absolute numbers, the number have not changed. That time it was 73 million households without electricity access. Now it has little bit increased, although percentage has gone down. So over the decades, we are increasing the percentages, but numbers are not reducing. That is one of the challenges. What is required? A number of studies have come that what should be the affirmative action on that. And India has certainly taken a large number of affirmative actions to increase the share of sustainable energy, and also to look for that everybody get access to electricity and cooking energy, modern energy. Number of programs are there. I'll not quote and waste time on that, but 2 major issues I would like to underline. Number 1, policies matter, number 1. And affordability is a major issue, which has been underlined in most of the issues, that if affordability is not there, whatsoever government make efforts, it is not going to become a sustainable kind of systems. You all, because you all are professionals here, I believe, and I am sure that there are large number of interventions which have come not only from government, but from the private sector, institute like TERI and others also, where we are looking for the Billion Light initiative and others. Where shoe pinches, why it is not taking off? crux down to what are the numbers. If we say for giving the basic subsistence level lighting services, you require $200 a lighting system and multiply by 80 million, then roughly we require only $16 billion for that purpose. It may not be a big issue if you look at the other kind of subsidies which Government of India is looking at. Issues like on the institutional structures to pass it and make it sustainable and providing a kind of affordability among the people who can manage and sustain it. 2 years back, I went on a trek for 60-kilometer trek in interior Himalaya. And after trekking 20 kilometers, I found a remote village. And I was told that 12 years back, some government agency has provided some solar light to them. And to my surprise, I could find 50 households in this village were still maintaining these solar lights, going far for getting it repaired and other things, because it was the felt need and no other option was competitive there. So this is one of the things that I realized that apart from affordability, it has to be linked with the economic activities also, which they were doing in the form of the tourism, where lighting was an essential thing for the tourists which come there and stay in their houses for that purpose. So we perhaps are in the right track in the country. If our plans move in the right direction that we are planning in the Government of India, apart from renewable energy, the conventional, a mix of that, India will perhaps be in position to achieve lighting energy access within next 5 years or so, if our plans go in the right way. And the new initiatives looks for more technologies, packages, as well as the other kind of instruments which perhaps are coming in the new form of the policies and guidelines in this way. But certainly there will be a need for the international collaboration in this form, sharing the experiences, and looking ahead beyond what we are doing with our national country efforts. Thank you very much. I have to say something.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Maitani, for raising some very important points, including on the critical question of affordability. I promised that I would give time to people in the room, but I'd like to also formulate some rules of the game. The first rule of the game is that if you want to raise a question, wait until you get the microphone. I assume there are roaming microphones somewhere. Secondly, once you get the microphone, please say who you are. Thirdly, a question is supposed to have a question mark in it. And fourthly, try and keep the question shorter than half an hour. So those are some very simple rules to go by. Yes, sir, here in the front. Could we please have a microphone here? And please indicate who you would like to address the question to.
I would request one of you or all of you to answer this question. It's based on the premise that a couple of decades ago, it was believed that poverty within countries was a tragedy. Today, it is universally acknowledged that poverty within a country is a scandal. There is adequate evidence that it costs more to keep the people poor than to get them out of poverty. We have reasonable confidence that SDGs, when they are evolved, will reflect the noblest of intents. The question, sir and ma'am, is how do we measure the impact of such goals? Now, what occurs to me is that would it be possible for World Bank or other institutions to rate a country's performance in terms of the rise in GDP of the bottom 50% of the population, rise in per capita of the bottom 50% of the population, and not be carried away by the global GDP macro figures, or any other indices which will measure the impact and effectiveness of whatever SDGs we set up?
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Akhtar, can I give that one to you?
I have a shot at it. How do we measure the impact of the goals, the first element of the question? I think there is a phenomenal amount of debate about this within the United Nations system, because of course the statistical capacities and measurement of the various goals are pretty uneven, both in terms of the goals as well as across the countries. So there's a lot of deliberations going on both in New York at the Statistical Commission that incorporates all the members, plus also within the regional commissions, statistical committees, and a lot of investment is needed in measurement of the sustainable goals and then subsequently monitoring. And realistically speaking, there will be goals for which we still will have to wait till the measurements emerge, because it's just not the goals, but there are also 169 targets, and we actually don't know how many will be eventually adopted. So that's about that. Now, on your issue of per capita incomes, I'm a bit lost, because I think in virtually all countries where you have household income expenditures, there is an attempt to measure the per capita distribution at the lower end, and predominantly, as I presented the evidence for Asia Pacific, that there is no doubt that income disparities are pretty significant. Whether you look at bottom 10 or bottom 20 or bottom 40, the reality is that there is income disparity. But the point that I was making is that it's not just about income disparities. There are a number of other disparities. Wealth we have talked about, and also there are excess disparities, and we heard about energy excess issue, where about 700 million do not have access to energy within Asia Pacific region. So I think we need a more holistic framework for capturing disparities. And I also mentioned that actually Sustainable Development Goals touches upon income disparities, not just within the countries, but also looking at across the globe.
Just on this question of measurement, and I want to pass that question through you on to Professor Yamanaka. I personally believe that one of the reasons why we've seen some progress in the climate negotiations is because we had the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, ably chaired by Dr. Pachauri. You have science underpinning a political process. We have no scientific process underpinning the Sustainable Development Goals or even the Millennium Development Goals. So if measurement is critical to implementation, and Dr. Akhtar, you've said why that is, then my question to you, Professor Yamanaka, is you talked about global governance. How do you see the system of global governance keeping its fingers on the pulse of implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals and bringing the message, positive or negative, back to politics?
That was a lacking point. The point that was lacked in my earlier presentation. I talked about the importance of governance, good governance, in making progress nationally or locally in moving forward with the achievement of MDGs. That was the survey we have conducted with regard to the implementation globally. And so I'm trying to respond to your question that as far as the climate change is concerned, we have an IPCC, and with its fifth latest assessment, we have a fairly good metrics to understand how much effort we need to make globally. But with regard to other areas, I certainly agree with you that we still lack a significant amount of information that would be needed to measure or to sort of metrics against which how much progress we need to make.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I certainly agree with you. That.
Okay. Thank you very much. The gentleman in front here.
I'm from Just One World, and I find that while everybody, all the, how shall I say, all the meaningful programs that we want fail on the altar of affordability. So why are they failing on affordability? Well, I have two suggestions. One is our income tax structure is not progressive enough, because the upper echelons are getting away with less taxes rather than we should be having them pay more taxes. Second is, our politicians are gutless when it comes to polluter must pay principle. Polluters are running away with pollution, polluting the environment, and challenging the environmental protection. So first, we should increase progressive usage of income tax to reduce social inequity. Second, polluters must pay to protect the environment. So those two major initiatives are not being addressed by our gutless politicians. And I suggest you start looking at those two options seriously. And maybe the Green International guy could answer the environmental protection issue, and Mr. Puri could answer the progressive income tax issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I didn't quite spot the question mark in your remarks, but you did talk about affordability, and I think, Mr. Maitani, that was an issue that you raised as well. Would you like to respond on that point?
Yeah, certainly in the context of energy, affordability is a major issue. Let us admit that. I give you some figures that in 2009, the Planning Commission, which is now Niti Aayog, came up with a kind of income, what is the below poverty line and all these assessments. And they decided a consumer basket that what should be the minimum level of expenditure a household, a person has to do. In that, they identified that for the person who is at the poverty line, around 60 rupees were earmarked for the lighting energy and cooking energy services for the household. If you are crossing beyond that 60 rupees, any intervention which is coming to the person, and particularly that time it mentioned that 42% of the population is below that line, which are not even to meet that threshold, then someone has to provide some supplement that in the form of subsidy or other. Here comes the role of affordability in a major context. The governments have a major role to meet that delta or that gap in order to make that affordable, the new kind of energy services or any other services which are in lieu of the existing services to make affordable.
Mr. Kalbag, I want to thank you very much for your question. And obviously what you've said is in the realm of a spectrum of policy measures that can be taken. But let me draw you back to what I said. You know, can we not look at one other very important thing, and which is technology? What can we do about ensuring that the cost of doing many of these things becomes far less? Let me give you a little example. We're all now beset with the idea of solar panels and wind panels. These are two sort of big buzzwords in the last few years. So, we're not having any great breakthrough technologies on solar, conversion of solar power for use, etc. We're really not having any fantastic breakthroughs or on wind power. But we were able to do a fair amount through the other methodologies available, which is mass production, large scales, etc. So what do we find? Neither is there much enthusiasm to invest hugely and collaborate on technological breakthroughs, maybe a Louis Pasteur kind of moment, or to allow the systems that the world has got to be able to get away with it, because those are all mired in trade disputes and this, that, and the other. So you're very right. You made some suggestions, but I think there are many other policy suggestions. India is a good example. Look at pharmaceuticals and the health sector. Just to leave these thoughts with everyone here, you gave me this opportunity to say so. Eva, thank you very much for letting me.
Okay, thank you very much. Over to the young lady.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Divya Chaudhary, and I'm a student at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. My question is very basic. I intend to know what is the basic key differentiator between the MDGs and the SDGs. It may be in the intent of the formulation or in the implementation. Thank you. And this goes out to any one of you.
Okay, the difference between the MDGs and the SDGs, who would like to pick up on that one?
There's a massive difference between the two. MDGs were very defined 8 goals, to put it very simplistically, but also it involved basically a silo approach that you actually picked up a sector and you said, well, we'd like movement in this area and movement in the other area. Of course, they served us very well, as has been talked about by other sessions. But SDG is a very holistic and an integrated approach. And it's actually a pretty complicated set of things, and that is why there is a lot of debate and concerns regarding its implementation. For one, it incorporates a phenomenal number of goals and indicators, and there is a concern that whether this can really be effectively universally adopted in a holistic manner. But I think more fundamental point that I'd like to mention, which is coming, is that, as I mentioned, it's really an alternative approach, because in the past we have thought if you fix one thing, you will solve the problem. But this is moving simultaneously on the track of economic growth, but insisting on inclusive and broad-based economic growth, but then looking at social deprivation in a much more holistic manner, and then looking at environmental. Now, the reason why it's looking at these three pillars is because if you do not progress in one area, you're going to hurt progress in the other area. So it's getting into the questions of interdependence and intergenerational equities, which have not been the subject of the MDGs.
I think my answer to your question would be that for me, the Millennium Development Goals were very much a yardstick for development cooperation, and the Sustainable Development Goals are much more about how we intend to change the development pattern of this planet as a whole. Over to the young lady over there, please.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Shivali. I work as a research associate at Emergent Ventures Private Limited. Well, my question is for all the panelists. If you look at the manufacturing sector, most of the developed nations have their manufacturing hubs in developing countries, for the simple reason that they get the same work done for very marginal rates. In such a scenario where income disparity is profitable for industries and manufacturers, what is the incentive for them to join this SDG agenda?
Ambassador, I think this is one for you.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear the question. Could you just briefly
I would repeat, yeah. So if you look at the manufacturing sector in developed countries, most of the developed countries have their manufacturing hubs in developing countries for the simple reason that they get it, manufactured at very low costs. So what is the, this is very profitable for them to do. This income disparity thing is making them profits. So how do you, what is the incentive for these industries and manufacturers to go for SDGs? I would like to know.
Look, I'll try to answer it, but let me make one very, very large...
Well, the question is, if corporates in industrialized countries are, as it were, enhancing disparity through cheap production in developing countries, how do you address that disparity issue in the context of Sustainable Development Goals? That's my free translation.
Thank you very much, Ivo. I'm grateful to you. Lady, let me give you an example. Which is the world's most valuable company?
Most valuable company?
Most valuable company, it's Apple. Okay. Right? They say its turnover has been more than that of the GDP of most countries. Why is Apple the world's most valuable company? Perhaps for one fundamental reason, that all their production is done by Foxconn in China, which is the other big growth story in the world. What am I trying to tell you? And why am I trying to say this to you? Of course, this is the nature of globalization, and this is the nature of the way things are done. But our effort in the developing world has to be able to harness globalization such that we too benefit. Do you seriously expect that the developed world will talk in terms of lowering itself? That will not happen. The best that we can look for is collaboration, being party to it, so that we can try and narrow the gap by raising ourselves somewhat. That's the bottom line. Somebody asked here a question about the MDGs and SDGs, and Mr. De Boer very rightly said that was about development cooperation. We don't want to do it anymore. So now we want an alternate path to development. I'm all for it. I'm all for it. But do remember that the bottom line of what the MDGs did or they didn't, the policy space that they did, brought about that one fact which I mentioned to you, that in the world as things currently stand, as they will stand, Large parts of the developing world have been able to build up large aggregates. This changes the global equity situation of the way the world is governed. So we must learn to do other things. We are told don't repeat the other guy's mistakes. Nobody wants to repeat the other person's mistakes. But please help. Be party to it. And there again we are told no money, no finances, no technology. But please don't do what we did. So that's the way global governance actually moves. And that's the way we need to participate and get into this act.
Okay.
We all need to be there.
Thank you very much. Over to you, sir.
I'm Ajit Kumar, editor, Radiance Media, and founder, Khushigram. Can we focus more on rural livelihoods instead of urban jobs in the SDGs? And because we know that rural people use less resources, they live a more sustainable lives than we in the urban areas. And the second part of question is businesses have very big opportunities in the villages. Smart logistics is one, renewable energy is another. And similarly, enhancing farming and food processing. So, and we know that farming is decreasing, the conditions of farms is very bad. You don't have farmers who want to do farming in the villages. Everybody wants small jobs in the cities. So how are you going to manage this?
Akhtar, can I give this one to you? It's a question about how, in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, can we place a greater emphasis on rural development, on rural jobs, not just in a farming context, but in a context of logistics as well. So how do you potentially see the Sustainable Development Goals helping in that context?
Well, thank you very much. It's an extremely important question, and it just, cuts into the core of the problem that we've been talking. The economic system is skewed from the very beginning. The economic system that we're using. And all what has been discussed referred to that and shows that. With Apple, for instance, the company, I agree by what was said. But in addition to that, the problem is that certain companies, the frontliner companies, they have changed the focus of their production. Apple has switched to the high-level consumers, and now the competition goes not along making the cost lower, but to make functionality richer, so that people could choose. And the middle-class people, they do not care. They want functionality, and they're ready to pay, in addition, $100 per piece in order to have the functionality they want, and design, and service, and everything. But the other side, I'm not going away from the rural problems. I'm just saying that, in fact, this type of economy marginalizes 2/3 of the existing consumer market, because more and more companies are oriented that way. And in fact, how would you call a company or a businessman that reduces the consumer base of the company? I don't think it's wise in the future, because it creates a lot of problems. And of course, agriculture, rural areas are hit by absolutely unfair taxation. The labor is taxed much more than the resources, and the situation should be completely different, and that will help in order to transit to the new economic system.
Thank you very much. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm Thorald from Norway. I have a question for my good friend, Ambassador Puri, whom I'm very pleased to see back from New York, where we both served a couple of years ago. Once again, you confirm that you're not only a brilliant speaker, you're also very, very convincing. In fact, it was only towards the very end of your statement that I stopped and wondered. And that's when you said, inequality within countries is essentially in the domain of the countries themselves. Now, in light of what you just said in response to the former question about Apple and Foxconn, do you think countries' ability to deal with inequality may be affected and perhaps somewhat limited by global forces, for example, like Apple? And if the answer to that is yes, do you think that conversation belongs in forums for global governance in general? And more specifically, should it be part of the conversation on climate change? Thank you.
I agree with you very much that issues of capital movement, issues of technology movement are all serious issues which have the potential to impact what people can do and what can be done in countries. But I want to remind you of what I told Mr. Kalbag a few minutes earlier, that essentially the menu of policies which are there, obviously you formulate the policies based on what you know in the world. It's very unlikely that you'll be the brilliant Nobel Prize winner who will come up with the ideas yourself. So this transfusion is in any case taking place. But the important thing is that the decisions on taking this lie essentially in your domain. You take into account what will happen in the rest of the world. In terms of, however, a multilateral agreement, we tend to have an agreement, or we want to have an agreement, in which there is a commitment at the multilateral level for us to do X, Y, or Z in the domestic concern, not be aware of what is happening. Therein lies the key issue which is there, and that's the heart of the debate on differentiation. Therein lies the entire nub of the issue of what is happening, the SDGs, the MDGs, and so on and so forth. So this is what I really meant, that the international community, and I at least coming from India, a country which is hugely committed to multilateralism, which was there at its birth in 1945 and before that, for us, the sine qua non of all of this is that multilateralism should help us in our development quest and certainly not add hurdles to it.
Thank you, Ambassador. Lady in the front here.
My question is to Dr. Shamshad. Can you please throw some light on inequality and polarization as you related both of them together?
I think countries that have had very steep inequalities, and I think there was a question earlier asked about Arab Spring experience. I think when I was working on the Middle East and North Africa, it was very graphic illustration of how it polarized unemployed population and resulted in provocation of something with one incident which had a contagion effect across the whole of the Middle East and North Africa. So there is no doubt that when wealth distribution gets extremely skewed and marginalizes people at the lower end, it ultimately not only results in the polarization and social tensions issues with it, but it can be very dangerous for the political cohesion, social and political cohesion in countries.
It's up to you who would like to answer my question. We're talking quite a bit about the section of population that does not have enough. But my question is, does the discussion around disparities and equity and the SDGs talking enough about consumption by people who have more than enough? Thank you.
Well, as I mentioned, I'm quite confused by the reports, official reports on that issue, because I think that the situation is not getting better. Compared to the beginning of the MDGs, now we have additional more than 300 million people entering the poverty level. I mean, in real terms, because I think there is a certain trick which is played. We attribute to the usual qualification, $1.5 per person per day. But in reality today, we should be talking about $2.50 per day if we want to include the normal reproductive capacity of the human being. And if we calculate on this base, then of course the results are less encouraging than it is described in the reports. However, I must say that Sustainable Development Goals seem to be addressing that on an absolutely new level. It is not relabeling MDG and postponing the deadline of the implementation. It is a really new approach, and when you will read the draft documents, it describes the inner connections, the systemic nature of the problem, I mean, we have to talk about not just poverty, but health, water, energy, etc., etc. And SDG makes that attempt. I do not want to say that that we can guarantee that the result will be positive, but at least it is a step ahead compared to MDG.
Thank you very much. And last, the lady there.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, the panelists, for the discussion. My name is Anne Grace Apita. So my question is still on global governance. Is Sustainable Development Goals coming up with policies that are practical, policies that are achievable for us to be able to make measurements towards what we are trying to deal with in the whole concept of climate change? Or are we just going to have the goals and then try to work within, the policies of our different countries? So it's really something that I'm wondering whether we are going to have policies that we can work towards, smart policies.
Okay, Dr. Yamanaka, are we going to have sustainable development goals that are practical, measurable, that will be implemented, or will, after they've been adopted, just countries focus on what they think they can achieve at the national level? I think a great question for you to end with. So the question is, can we be sure that the Sustainable Development Goals will be formulated in a way that is practical and implementable and relevant to developing countries, or will the goals probably just be ignored while countries carry on with what they feel is important?
Well, thank you very much. I think that the SDGs, with its some underlying targets, will be decided globally. But the question is how these goals and targets can be implemented effectively, nationally, regionally, and locally. And this is closely related to the question of means of implementation. And of course, finance and technology is extremely important. But at the same time, how to build capacities of institutions and personal capacities, human capacities, is another very big issue that we need to pay more attention. And so in that sense, how we can, on the one hand, to address improved inclusivity, inclusive development, and also at the same time, how we can empower people in that sense.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's not just about the goals, it's also about the means of implementation. Dr. Akhtar pointed to the fact that there are other important stepping stones on the way to the SDGs, including the whole financing for development debate. So in that sense, these processes are interrelated. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank the best panelists who were in the room and the almost as best panelists who are up here on the stage. But thank you all very much for the contribution to this discussion on the meaning of the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.